He expected a black-edged letter within the year. He had paid for it, after all. A quiet passing, a discreet burial in some forgotten corner of the overgrown churchyard, a problem solved with a solicitor's signature and a pouch of gold. He had purchased a wife to die for him, a convenient legal fiction to satisfy his grandfather's will and secure the vast, troublesome inheritance that was more burden than blessing. He did not expect to return 2 years later, broken and bled dry by politics and war, to find the tomb he had sent her to not only inhabited, but fiercely, defiantly alive. He did not expect to find her, the woman he had abandoned to the damp and the rot, not moldering in a grave, but ruling a kingdom she had carved from the heart of his ruin. He certainly did not expect that her survival would become the one thing he could not bear to lose. The solicitor's office smelled of stale paper and finality. Dust motes danced in the thin, gray light slanting through the tall, grimy window, illuminating the worn patches on the turkey carpet. Alistair, Duke of Blackwood, felt the grit of it under his polished boots and wished himself elsewhere. Anywhere else, a muddy trench in Flanders would be an improvement. At least there, the enemies were honest about their intentions. Here, they cloaked their avarice in threadbare silks and desperate, watery smiles. Across the vast mahogany desk, Ilara sat ramrod straight, a small, pale figure swallowed by the heavy oak chair. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, the knuckles white. She looked, he thought with a flicker of detached cruelty, like a porcelain doll left out in the rain, fragile and already showing the first signs of cracking. A faint, persistent cough, delicate as a bird's wing, was the only sound she made. Her aunt, a woman whose face was a roadmap of faded beauty and mounting panic, did all the talking. "A good match, Your Grace." "A very good match," the woman chirped, her voice too bright for the somber room. "Ilara is quiet, you see. Well-bred. She will not be a bother. Her constitution, well, the London air has never agreed with her. The country will be the very thing." Alistair did not look at Ilara. He kept his eyes fixed on the sheaf of documents before him, his signature a black, brutalist slash at the bottom of each page. The marriage settlement, the title transfer, the amendment to his will. It was a business transaction, nothing more. He was purchasing a placeholder, a name to satisfy the clause that required him to be wed by his 30th birthday or forfeit the Blackwood estates to a cousin he despised. The girl was an orphan, penniless, and by all accounts sickly. Her aunt was desperate to be rid of the financial and social burden. The solicitor, Mr. Grimshaw, had presented her as the perfect solution, a bride who would ask for nothing and, if the doctor's grim prognosis was to be believed, would not inconvenience him for long. "Her health is a delicate matter," Alistair stated, his voice a low rumble that seemed to absorb the room's meager light. It was not a question or an expression of concern. It was a confirmation of terms. "A mild affliction of the lungs," the aunt said, waving a dismissive hand. "Nothing a bit of country air won't mend." Ilara's gaze flickered towards her aunt, a brief, sharp glint of something that was not frailty. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but Alistair, a man trained to notice the slightest shift in an opponent's stance, registered it. For the first time, he looked at her directly. Her eyes were not the watery blue he had expected, but a startling, lucid gray, the color of a winter storm. They held his for a bare second, and in their depths he saw not fear or desperation, but a cold, clear appraisal that was unervingly similar to his own. She knew precisely what this was. A sale, and she was the goods. He felt a prickle of something unpleasant, an emotion too complex to be named and too inconvenient to be explored. He squashed it ruthlessly. He had a war to finance and a political faction to dismantle. He had no time for the nuances of a destitute orphan's pride. "The carriage will be ready in an hour," he said, rising from his chair. The movement was economical, final. He addressed the aunt, not the girl who was now legally his wife. His Duchess. The title was a farce. She will be taken to Blackwood Manor. A housekeeper is in residence. Mrs. Croft. She will see to her needs. The aunt's relief was a palpable, cloying thing. "Of course, Your Grace." Thank you, Your Grace. You are too kind. He was not kind. He was pragmatic. He placed a heavy purse on the desk. For your troubles, it was the final payment, the severance. He turned to leave, his mind already leaping ahead to a meeting with the War Office. Your Grace. The voice was quiet, but it cut through the room's cloying atmosphere like a shard of glass. It was Alara. He turned back, impatient. She had risen from her chair and stood with a strange, unnerving stillness. The top of her head barely reached his breastbone. My dowry, she said, her gray eyes fixed on his waistcoat, is not much. A collection of books. My father's. I am told they are to be shipped separately. Alistair stared at her. Of all the things she could have said, this was the last he expected. Not a plea, not a tear, not a word of thanks for being saved from utter penury. A question about her books. They will be sent to the manor, he said curtly. What did he care for a dead man's books? Thank you, she said. She did not curtsy. She simply inclined her head, a gesture of acknowledgement between equals, not one of supplication. Then she sat back down, folded her hands in her lap, and resumed her unnerving silence, the perfect portrait of a porcelain doll waiting to be shelved. As he strode from the office, leaving the scent of desperation and ink behind him, Alistair found he could not shake the image of her eyes. Not frail, not sickly, but cold, clear, and appallingly, unforgivably alive. The journey to Blackwood Manor was a study in miserable silence. The carriage swayed and jolted over rutted roads that grew progressively worse the farther they traveled from London's sprawling grasp. A persistent, weeping rain began to fall, blurring the landscape into a watercolor of gray and sodden green. Inside, the air was thick with the unsaid. Alara sat on one side, Alistair on the other, a chasm of green velvet upholstery between them. He did not speak to her, instead immersing himself in a portfolio of documents. The sharp scratch of his pen, the only sound to compete with the drumming of rain on the roof and the rhythmic clatter of the horse's hooves. Alara watched the world dissolve outside her window. The rolling hills gave way to bleak, wind-swept moorland, dotted with skeletal trees and granite outcrops that looked like broken teeth. The air grew colder, seeping through the carriage walls, carrying a damp, earthy scent of decay and wet leaves. It was a smell she knew intimately, the smell of sick rooms and finality. Her aunt's words about country air echoed in her mind with a grim, hollow irony. This was not the gentle, healing countryside of novels. This was a place where things came to die. She felt the familiar tightness in her chest, a warning ache that had been her constant companion for years. She drew her thin wool cloak tighter, a useless gesture against the profound chill that was sinking into her bones. She risked a glance at the man opposite her, the Duke of Blackwood, her husband. He was an imposing figure, even sitting down. Broad-shouldered and lean, he filled his side of the carriage with an aura of contained, dangerous energy. His face, in the fleeting glimpses she caught, was all hard lines and shadows, a face carved from the same unforgiving granite as the landscape outside. He had not looked at her once since they had left the solicitor's office. She was a piece of luggage he was transporting, an inconvenient but necessary part of his itinerary. She was not afraid of him. Fear was a luxury she had long ago learned she could not afford. What she felt was a cold, hard knot of resolve forming in her gut. She had been sold to this man to die quietly and make him rich. She had seen the calculation in his eyes, the dismissive appraisal of her worth. He had purchased a ghost. He would find she was still stubbornly, inconveniently, made of flesh and blood. She did not know what she would do or how she would survive, but as the carriage plunged deeper into the heart of his neglected lands, a flicker of defiance sparked within her. She would not be a quiet, obliging victim. She had survived poverty, sickness, and the cloying pity of relatives. She would survive this. Hours later, the carriage slowed, turning off the main road and onto a private track that was little more than 2 deep ruts carved through a tunnel of overgrown trees. Branches, heavy with rain, scraped against the roof and windows like skeletal fingers. A profound darkness fell, the canopy of ancient oaks and yews blotting out the weak afternoon light. The air grew thick with the smell of mildew and rot. Finally, the carriage lurched to a halt. The door was pulled open by a footman whose livery was damp and frayed. "We've arrived, Your Grace," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Alistair folded his papers and tucked them away without a word. He stepped out of the carriage, into the mud and the ceaseless drizzle. Alara gathered her cloak and followed, her thin-soled shoes sinking immediately into the cold, grasping mire of the driveway. She looked up, and her breath caught. Blackwood Manor was not a house. It was a carcass, a vast, Gothic monstrosity of blackened stone. It loomed against the bruised purple sky like a rotting tooth. Entire wings were dark, their windows boarded over or shattered. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, choked the walls, pulling stones loose and crawling over the slate roof, which sagged in several places. What must have once been a grand sweep of lawn was now a wilderness of weeds and tangled briars. The air was heavy with the silence of profound neglect. It was a tomb, just as he had intended. Alistair stood for a moment, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the ruin. He seemed not to notice the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead or the mud ruining his expensive boots. He was looking at a memory, a weight he carried. This place was his burden, and he had just brought her here to share it, or rather, to be buried under it. An elderly woman in a severe black dress stood silhouetted in the massive, open doorway. Her face was a mask of pinched disapproval. This had to be Mrs. Croft. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her voice as brittle as dry leaves. Her gaze flickered to Alara, lingering for a moment with an expression of open contempt before dismissing her entirely. "Croft," Alistair acknowledged. He turned, and for the first time since the journey began, he addressed Alara directly. His eyes were devoid of any emotion. "This is Blackwood. Mrs. Croft will show you to your rooms. I am returning to London." Alara stared at him. He was leaving. Now, he had brought her to this desolate place only to abandon her on its doorstep. The cold knot in her stomach tightened. "You are not staying?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear over the patter of rain. "My duties are in London," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I have no use for this place." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but brutally clear. "And I have no use for you." He gave a curt nod to the housekeeper, a silent order. Then, without another word, without a backward glance, he climbed back into the waiting carriage. The footman slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. The driver cracked his whip, and the carriage lurched forward, wheels churning mud, and disappeared back into the dark, dripping tunnel of trees. Alara stood alone in the rain, the mud sucking at her shoes. She was cold, damp, and utterly abandoned. Before her stood the decaying manor, a monument to his indifference. In the doorway, the hostile housekeeper waited, her arms crossed, a dragon guarding the entrance to a crypt. This was her new home. This was the place she was supposed to die. A wet, racking cough shook her frame. She pressed a hand to her chest, fighting for breath in the heavy, sodden air. For a single, terrifying moment, despair washed over her, a cold tide that threatened to pull her under. It would be so easy to give in, to let the cold and the damp and the hopelessness claim her. It was what he wanted. It was what everyone expected. But as she looked at the hostile face of the housekeeper and the looming, arrogant decay of the house, that small, defiant spark from the carriage ride ignited into a flame of pure, unadulterated anger. He had left her here to rot. He thought her a fragile doll to be discarded. He was wrong. She lifted her chin, straightened her shoulders, and met the housekeeper's malevolent stare. She took a step forward, pulling her foot from the mud with a soft, sucking sound. Then another. She would not die quietly. She would not die at all. She would live, if only to spite him. She walked towards the dark doorway of Blackwood Manor, not as a victim entering her tomb, but as a queen entering a conquered, hostile kingdom. Her reign had just begun. The room Mrs. Croft assigned her was in the north wing, a vast, frigid chamber where the scent of mildew was so strong it was almost a physical presence. A heavy, dark tapestry depicting a grim hunting scene covered one wall, its threads damp and smelling of dust and ages. The colossal four-poster bed was draped in faded, moth-eaten velvet, and the air held a permanent, bone-deep chill that the small, grudgingly lit fire in the grate could not begin to combat. A persistent drip from a corner of the ceiling punctuated the silence, each drop landing on the warped floorboards with a sound like a ticking clock counting down her final hours. For 3 days, Alara lay in that bed, trapped by a feverish exhaustion that was part illness and part despair. The journey, the cold, the sheer oppressive weight of the house, it had all conspired to drain her of her will. Mrs. Croft appeared twice a day with a tray bearing a bowl of thin, tasteless gruel and a jug of lukewarm water. The housekeeper never spoke, merely placed the tray on a nearby table with a thud and departed, her disapproval a tangible force in the room. Alara was being treated not as the Duchess of Blackwood, but as an inconvenient patient in a charity ward, one whose recovery was neither expected nor desired. She drifted in and out of a shallow, restless sleep, the drip in the corner a constant, maddening metronome. She felt her strength seeping away, absorbed by the damp stone walls and the cold, clinging sheets. This was it, she thought in a moment of bleak lucidity. This was how it ended. In a cold room, alone, forgotten, just as the Duke had planned. The anger that had sustained her on her arrival had been extinguished by the relentless, suffocating dampness. On the morning of the 4th day, she awoke to a sliver of weak sunlight finding its way through a gap in the heavy curtains. The drip continued its remorseless rhythm. The gruel sat untouched from the night before, a congealed gray puddle in its bowl. She coughed, a deep, rattling sound that tore at her lungs and left her breathless. Lying there, weak and shivering, she looked at the water stains spreading on the ceiling, a bloom of darkness like a map of her own failing body. She could die here. The thought was not one of despair this time, but a simple, cold fact. She could lie in this bed, drink the thin gruel, listen to the drip, and fade away. No one would stop her. No one would care. Her husband had paid for this exact outcome. And that was when it happened. The turning point. It was not a grand epiphany, but a small, sharp, visceral rebellion. A white-hot clarity that burned through the feverish fog. She thought of the Duke's cold, dismissive eyes. She thought of his back as he walked away from her in the rain. She thought of the insulting finality of his departure. He had sentenced her to death, not with a blade or a poison, but with neglect. And she would be damned if she would be so obliging. Anger, pure and potent, surged through her veins, a heat more powerful than any fever. It was a resurrection. With a groan, she pushed herself up. The room spun, and black spots danced in her vision. But she gritted her teeth and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet touched the icy floorboards, and a shock of cold shot up her spine. She stood, swaying, her nightgown hanging off her thin frame. She was weak, yes, but she was standing. She was alive. She took a shuffling step, then another, using the bedpost for support. She made her way to the window, and, with a strength she did not know she possessed, tore the heavy curtains aside. Gray light flooded the room, revealing the full extent of the decay. Dust lay thick on every surface, and the damp had caused the wallpaper to peel away in long, curling strips. It was a tomb, but she was not dead yet. When Mrs. Croft entered an hour later with the morning gruel, she stopped dead in the doorway. Alara was not in bed. She was sitting in the room's single armchair, which she had dragged in front of the meager fire. She was fully dressed in the simple gray traveling dress she had arrived in, her hair brushed and pinned up. She was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes, but those eyes, when they met the housekeeper's, were blazing. "Good morning, Mrs. Croft," Alara said, her voice raspy but firm. The housekeeper stared, nonplussed. "You should be in bed, madam." The madam was laced with insolence. "I have been in bed," Alara replied calmly. "I have decided I do not like it. This gruel is inedible. From now on, I will have tea and toast for breakfast. In the morning room, if it is habitable. If not, I will take it here. And this fire is to be built up. I want this room to be warm. Mrs. Croft's lips thinned into a bloodless line. The Duke gave no such instructions. The house is run on a strict budget. The Duke, Elara said, her voice dropping, taking on a new and surprising edge of command, is in London. I am the Duchess of Blackwood, and I am here. You will find that the budget is now my concern, as is the running of this house. Bring me the account ledgers. All of them. For the last 5 years. The housekeeper's jaw actually dropped. For a moment, the two women stared at each other, a silent battle of wills waged in the cold, damp room. Mrs. Croft's authority was built on years of neglect and the Duke's absence. Elara's was built on nothing but the sheer, audacious force of her own will. It was Mrs. Croft who looked away first. She gave a stiff, resentful nod. As you wish. Your Grace, the title was choked out, a bitter pill. She backed out of the room, leaving the gruel behind. Elara listened to her footsteps receding down the hall. A fit of coughing seized her, and she bent over, pressing a hand to her aching ribs. The effort had cost her dearly. She was trembling with weakness, but as she straightened up, a grim smile touched her lips. The first shot had been fired. The reclamation of Blackwood Manor had begun. The ledgers arrived that afternoon, a stack of dusty, leather-bound tomes dropped onto a table by a sullen housemaid. Elara spent the rest of the day and the day after that, hunched over them at the rickety writing desk, a thick shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The fire was, as she had commanded, built higher, and the warmth, though it still felt like a small island in an ocean of cold, was a comfort. The tea was weak and the toast was burnt, but it was not gruel. It was a victory. What she found in the ledgers was a story of systematic neglect and petty theft. The strict budget Mrs. Croft had spoken of was a fiction. Huge sums were allocated for supplies that clearly never arrived. The wages for a full staff of 30 were being drawn, though Elara had seen no more than 5 servants, all of them listless and sullen. Mrs. Croft, it turned out, was not just a hostile housekeeper. She was a remarkably successful embezzler, bleeding the absent Duke's estate dry while living in relative comfort herself. Elara's anger gave way to a cold, calculating fury. She was not just fighting against neglect, she was fighting against corruption. On the third morning after her stand, she summoned Mrs. Croft to the morning room. It was a dusty, shrouded space, but Elara had ordered the dust sheets removed from one table and 2 chairs. She sat with the ledgers open before her. "You sent for me, Your Grace?" Mrs. Croft asked, her tone still bordering on insolent. "I did," Elara said, not looking up from the books. She tapped a page with one ink-stained finger. "I have been reviewing the household accounts. They are fascinating. For instance, according to this, we purchased 20 sides of beef last month. I have seen no evidence of them, nor the 100 weight of flour, nor the 12 barrels of ale. You have been paying wages to 25 ghosts, Mrs. Croft." The color drained from the housekeeper's face. The mask of pinched disapproval crumbled, revealing raw panic. "I don't know what you mean," she stammered. "Oh, I think you do," Elara said, finally looking up. Her gray eyes were like chips of ice. "You have been robbing this estate blind. You assumed the Duke would never return, and you assumed I would die before I noticed. You were wrong on both counts." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "You're dismissed. You will be out of this house by noon. If you are fortunate, I will not send these ledgers to the magistrate." Mrs. Croft stared, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. The threat, unspoken but clear, was prison. All the fight went out of her. She deflated, aging 10 years in a matter of seconds. Without another word, she turned and fled. The dismissal of the housekeeper sent a shockwave through the skeletal staff. They watched Elara with a new mixture of fear and grudging respect. She was not the dying waif they had been led to expect. She was something else entirely. Her next act was to walk the grounds. It was a daunting task. The gardens were a jungle, the greenhouses were collapsing, and the outbuildings were rotting. But in the stables, she found a man mending a piece of tack, his hands gnarled but capable. He was older, with a weathered face and clear, honest eyes. "You are?" she asked. "Thomas, your grace. The groundsman, or what's left of him," he said, his voice a low rumble. He did not seem surprised to see her. "What is still functional on this estate, Thomas?" she asked, getting straight to the point. He considered for a moment. "The well is good. The south-facing wall of the kitchen garden gets sun, if you could clear it. The roof over the main block, the kitchen, and the stables is mostly sound. The rest," he trailed off, shrugging. "The rest is losing the fight." "Then we will stop fighting for it," Alara declared. "We will consolidate. I want the north and west wings closed off completely. Board the windows, lock the doors. We will live in the central part of the house. We will heat only the rooms we use. I want that kitchen garden cleared and planted. Potatoes, cabbages, carrots, whatever will grow. Can you do that?" Thomas looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. It was the first genuine smile she had seen at Blackwood. "Ah, your grace. I can do that." In that moment, she gained her first ally. The weeks that followed were a blur of relentless work. Alara, with Thomas as her loyal lieutenant, began the Sisyphean task of reclaiming Blackwood. They were joined by two of the younger maids, who, freed from Mrs. Croft's oppressive rule, showed a surprising willingness to work. The rest of the ghost staff were summarily dismissed from the payroll. Alara moved her own quarters to a smaller, sunnier room overlooking the nascent kitchen garden. She directed the boarding up of the vast, useless wings, shutting the door on the rot and concentrating their limited resources. The house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, shrinking to a manageable, defensible size. She sold off rotting furniture and decaying tapestries from the closed sections to a dealer in the local village, using the meager funds to buy seeds, tools, and glass for the greenhouse. She spent her evenings with the ledgers, not just as an accountant, but as a general, planning her campaign. She discovered a talent she never knew she possessed, a genius for practical management. The world she was building was small, but it was functional. The kitchen, once cold and silent, was now filled with the scent of baking bread and vegetable soup. The garden began to show neat rows of green shoots. There was warmth, there was food, and there was purpose. She rarely thought of the Duke. He was an abstraction, a distant landlord whose neglect had provided the canvas for her work. The house was no longer his. It was hers. She had bought it not with coin, but with sheer will, with ink-stained fingers and the ache in her lungs from the damp air. She had stopped coughing so much. The work, the purpose, the warm, dry rooms, they were a better medicine than any doctor could have prescribed. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly 2 years after her arrival, she was in the study, what had once been the Duke's private domain, now her command center, arguing with Thomas over the best way to repair a section of the stable roof before winter. She had a smudge of dirt on her cheek and a smear of ink on her cuff. The room was filled with the scent of wood smoke from the fire and beeswax from the polished furniture. It was warm, comfortable, and alive. The sound of a horse arriving at a gallop in the front drive made them both fall silent. It was a sound that had not been heard at Blackwood in years. A moment later, the front door, which was no longer barred, was flung open with a crash that echoed through the house. Heavy, booted footsteps, angry and exhausted, strode into the main hall. Thomas looked at Alara, his eyes wide. A tall, imposing figure filled the doorway of the study, blotting out the light from the hall. He was cloaked in shadows, drenched from a sudden downpour, and he radiated a cold, weary fury. He stared into the warm, bright room, at the crackling fire, the polished wood, the woman at the desk who looked up at him with calm, intelligent eyes. His own face was a mask of utter disbelief. "You're alive," Alistair, Duke of Blackwood, said. His voice was a raw, incredulous rasp. Alara met his gaze without flinching. A slow, cool smile touched her lips. "I apologize," she said, her voice dripping with magnificent irony, "for the inconvenience." Alistair stood dripping on the threshold of the study. A ghost returned to a home he no longer recognized. He had ridden for 2 days straight, fleeing the cesspit of London, the endless political maneuvering, the hollow-eyed sycophants, the weight of 1,000 duties that were grinding his soul to dust. He had come to Blackwood seeking a grave, a place of silence and endings, where he could collapse into the rot and be left alone. He had pictured the house as he had left it, dark, crumbling, a fitting monument to the decay in his own spirit. He had expected to find a letter on a silver tray informing him of his wife's demise, the final neat conclusion to his messy inheritance problem. Instead, he found this. Warmth, light, the scent of wood smoke and something else, rosemary. The floorboards in the hall, which he remembered as gray with dust, gleamed. And here, in his study, the room he had always kept as a sanctuary of cold order, a fire blazed in the hearth. The furniture shone, and at his desk, sat a woman who was a stranger to him. It was her, the sickly girl from the solicitor's office, but transformed. The fragility he remembered was gone, replaced by a sinewy strength. Her face was still pale, but it was no longer wan. It was the luminescence of a pearl. There was dirt on her cheek and ink on her fingers, and she looked magnificent. She looked like a queen on her throne, and he was the intruder. Her words, laced with a cool, cutting irony that he had not anticipated, hung in the air between them. I apologize for the inconvenience. It was a perfect riposte, a verbal thrust that slid right between his ribs. It told him instantly that she knew exactly why he was shocked to see her, and she did not give a damn. Behind her, the groundsman, Thomas, straightened up, his hand resting on the back of her chair in a gesture that was unconsciously protective. The man's loyalty, Alistair realized with another jolt, was not to him, the Duke who paid his wages, but to her. "What is this?" Alistair finally managed to say, gesturing vaguely at the room, at the entire impossible reality of the revitalized house. "What have you done?" "I believe the term is housekeeping," Elara replied, her voice cool and even. She did not rise. She did not show any deference. She held his gaze, and her storm-gray eyes were unblinking. "You abandoned your house, Your Grace. I simply chose not to be buried in it." The sheer audacity of her stole his breath. He had left her to die, and she was chastising him for poor property management. The absurdity of it was a sharp, bitter pill. He was exhausted, soaked to the bone, and his carefully constructed world was tilting on its axis. He had come here for silence, and he had walked into a confrontation with a woman he had completely and utterly underestimated. "This is my house," he stated, the words coming out as a low growl. It was a weak reassertion of an authority he suddenly felt slipping through his fingers. "Indeed," she agreed, inclining her head with that same unnerving gesture of an equal he remembered from the solicitor's office. "The ledgers confirm it. They also confirm it was on the brink of financial collapse due to mismanagement and rampant theft. I took the liberty of correcting that. You are now merely running at a significant loss, rather than a catastrophic one. You're welcome." Alistair stared at her. He, the man who debated budgets in the House of Lords, who managed vast, complex investments that propped up the Crown's war efforts, was being lectured on fiscal responsibility by a woman in an ink-stained dress. A wave of fury, hot and potent, washed away his exhaustion. "You had no right," he snarled. "I had every right," she countered, her voice rising for the first time, sharpened to a fine point. "The right of a castaway on a desert island to build a shelter. The right of a prisoner to clean her own cell. You left me on a sinking ship, Duke. Do not return 2 years later and criticize me for patching the hull." She stood then, a fluid movement that brought her to her full, unimposing height. But she was not unimposing. She held her ground before him, a small, unshakable bastion of will. "Thomas," she said, her tone softening as she addressed the groundsman, "we will discuss the stable roof tomorrow." "Thank you." It was a dismissal, and the groundsman nodded, shot Alistair a wary, distrustful look, and exited the room, leaving them alone. The silence that descended was thick and charged. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Alistair's wet cloak dripped onto the polished floorboards, forming a dark puddle at his feet. He felt like a barbarian who had just stormed a convent. "I need a room," he said, his voice flat. "And a bath." "The north and west wings are closed," she informed him, "to conserve heat and funds. Your former chambers are uninhabitable. Damp. I believe there's a fungus. You can have a guest room adjacent to mine in the east wing. It is small, but is dry and warm. I will have one of the maids see to the water." She spoke with the calm, detached efficiency of an innkeeper addressing a weary traveler. She had just informed him that his ancestral rooms were rotting and offered him a spare bedroom, as if he were a distant cousin who had shown up unannounced. The power dynamic had shifted so completely it was dizzying. He was no longer the master of this house. He was a guest, a tenant, and she was the landlady. He wanted to rage. He wanted to roar and smash things and reassert his dominance. But he was too tired. The fight in London had taken everything out of him, and this unexpected battle had finished the job. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her posture, the intelligence in her eyes, and the dirt on her cheek that was a testament to the work she had done. He saw not a duchess, not a wife, but a survivor who had stared into the abyss he had prepared for her and had refused to jump. "Fine," he clipped out. She nodded once. "Welcome home, Your Grace," she said, and the words were not a welcome at all. They were a challenge. The days that followed were a cold war fought in the corridors of a house that was now her territory. Alistair found himself a stranger in his own home. The few remaining servants, Thomas, two maids named Mary and Jane, and a cook Alara had hired from the village, treated him with a fearful, distant respect. But their loyalty, their casual conversation, their comfort was reserved for her. He would walk into the kitchen to find them laughing with the Duchess over a bowl of rising dough, only for them to fall silent and scatter at his approach. He was the Duke. He was the master, but he held no power here. The true ruler of Blackwood was the woman he had tried to discard. He watched her, unable to stop himself. She rose with the sun, her days a whirlwind of practical activity. He saw her in the garden, her sleeves rolled up, conferring with Thomas over the vegetable patch. He saw her in the kitchens, tasting a soup and suggesting a pinch more time. He found her in the evenings in the study, her head bent over the account books, a furrow of concentration between her brows. She moved with a purpose that he, for all his titles and duties, suddenly realized he lacked. His work in London was a series of battles, of holding lines and managing decline. It was about power and prestige. Her work here was about life. It was about coaxing warmth from cold stone, food from dead earth. He found his own routines disrupted. The small guest room was, as she'd promised, warm and dry, but it was cramped. It felt temporary. He wandered the habitable parts of the house like a restless spirit, his presence a discordant note in the quiet harmony she had created. He tried to read in the library, but the room, though clean, felt unused and cold, outside the sphere of her influence. The heart of the house was now the study, the kitchen, the garden. It was her heart. One afternoon, driven by a need to reclaim some piece of his former life, he strode into the study. She was at the desk, as usual, mending a tear in a linen sheet with small, neat stitches. The domesticity of the act, performed at the seat of his ancestral power, was a particular affront. "I need to see the estate accounts," he said without preamble. She didn't look up from her sewing. "They're in the third drawer on the left," she said. "The key is on the mantelpiece. I have organized them by quarter. You will find my annotations in red ink." Her placid compliance was more infuriating than any argument. He found the key, unlocked the drawer, and pulled out a ledger. It was a new one. Her handwriting was clear and precise, and, as she'd said, it was filled with annotations in red ink. Negotiated a 10% discount on seed stock from Miller's Farm. Sold leaf from derelict West Wing roof. Proceeds used for new shingles on main block. Bartered 30 jars of preserved damsons for 2 pigs from Lower Fen. It was a meticulous, ruthless, and brilliant record of survival. She had not just managed the estate. She had transformed it from a money pit into a self-sustaining enterprise. He saw the sale of heirlooms he had forgotten existed, the leasing of fallow fields he had never bothered with, the brutal but necessary cutting of every conceivable expense. She had saved this place. She had done what he, with all his resources and education, had failed to do. He closed the ledger with a soft thud. He felt a grudging, infuriating flicker of respect. It was an unwelcome emotion, and he pushed it away. "You sold the Gainsborough miniature," he stated, his voice flat. She looked up then, her gray eyes meeting his. "I did. It was either your gray-tant's portrait or the roof over the kitchens. I chose the roof. I reasoned we had a greater need for shelter than for another painting of a sour-faced woman." The bluntness of her logic was unassailable. He could not argue with it. He had left her with nothing, and she had made choices. Hard choices. "You should have written to me," he said, the accusation sounding weak even to his own ears. "You could have asked for funds." A strange, sad smile touched her lips. "Ask you? The man who left me in the mud without a backward glance? Why would I do that? To beg for scraps to keep your tomb from collapsing on my head? No, thank you. I have learned it is better to rely on myself." The truth of her words struck him like a physical blow. He had given her no reason to trust him, no reason to expect anything from him but neglect. Her independence, her fierce self-reliance, was a fortress she had built, and he himself had laid the foundation stone. He stood there, the powerful Duke of Blackwood, utterly disarmed. He was an intruder in a world of her making, a world that ran on logic and hard work and preserved damsons. His title meant nothing here. His anger was useless. He was irrelevant. And that, more than anything else, was terrifying. He had come to Blackwood seeking oblivion, and instead, he had found himself utterly, irrevocably seen. The autumn deepened, stripping the leaves from the trees and draping the moors in a perpetual shroud of mist. The rains began in earnest, not the gentle weeping of summer, but a cold, driving assault that hammered against the slate roofs and turned the grounds into a quagmire. The house, which had felt so warm and secure, now seemed to shrink in on itself, a small bastion of light against a vast, encroaching darkness. Alistair felt the gloom of the weather seep into his bones, mirroring the bleakness in his soul. His retreat from London had not brought peace, only a different kind of war, a silent, internal siege. Alara, too, felt the change in the season. The damp air brought back the familiar ache in her lungs, a ghostly reminder of the illness she had fought so hard to overcome. She pushed herself harder, working from dawn until dusk, supervising the final preparations for winter. The harvest had to be stored, the last of the roof repairs completed, the firewood stacked and seasoned. It was a race against the coming cold, and she ran it with a fierce, almost desperate energy. Ignoring the tightness in her chest was an act of will, a refusal to acknowledge any weakness. The crisis, when it came, was not grand or dramatic. It was a small, insidious failure. A section of the roof over the east wing, one Thomas had warned her was weak, but which she hadn't had the funds to completely replace, finally gave way. It was not a collapse, but a persistent, treacherous leak, and it was directly over her bedroom. It started as a drip, eerily reminiscent of her first days at Blackwood. She moved her bed, but the damp had already permeated the room, clinging to the curtains, the bedding, the very air she breathed. The chill was relentless. She woke one morning shivering, her body aching and her breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. The old enemy had found a way in. She tried to fight it. She got up, dressed, and went down to the study, determined to work through it. But the columns of figures in the ledger swam before her eyes. A fire had been lit, but she could not get warm. A violent coughing fit seized her, leaving her clinging to the desk, dizzy and breathless. It was there that Alistair found her. He had entered the study to escape his own restless thoughts and stopped dead in the doorway. She was pale as death, her lips tinged with blue, her hand pressed to her chest as she fought for every breath. The strength and vitality that had so infuriated and impressed him were gone, replaced by a terrifying fragility. She looked exactly as he had imagined she would look when he first bought her, a porcelain doll, shattering. And the sight broke something in him. He did not think. He reacted. He crossed the room in 2 strides, sweeping her up into his arms. She was shockingly light, a bundle of sharp bones and trembling heat. She was burning with fever. "No," she rasped, trying to push against his chest, her defiance a faint echo of its usual strength. "I'm Fine." "You are a terrible liar," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. It felt like fear. He carried her out of the study and up the stairs, his long strides eating up the distance. The maids, Mary and Jane, saw them and scurried out of the way, their faces pale with alarm. He didn't take her to her own damp, cold room. He strode past it without a second thought and carried her into his own, the small, warm guest room she had assigned him. He laid her gently on the bed, his bed, and pulled the covers up to her chin. She was shivering violently now, her teeth chattering. "The roof," she whispered, her eyes cloudy with fever. It leaked. Guilt, sharp and cold, pierced through his alarm. Her illness was not just a relapse. It was a direct consequence of the poverty he had inflicted on her. The roof she couldn't afford to fix. The house he had abandoned. He had done this. His neglect was a poison that had finally, after 2 years, found its mark. "Be quiet," he ordered, his voice harsher than he intended. He strode to the fireplace and began building the fire up, piling on logs until it was roaring, a furnace against the encroaching cold. He needed to fight the damp, to burn it out of the room, out of her. He dispatched a terrified Jane to fetch every blanket in the house and to keep kettles of water boiling on the kitchen stove. He sent Thomas, his face grim, to ride to the village for the doctor, a journey that would take hours in the relentless rain. And then he was alone with her. He sat in the chair by the bed and watched her. She had drifted into a feverish, restless sleep, muttering fragments of words. Ledger's seeds, the west wing, cold. She was still trying to manage her kingdom from the depths of her delirium. He felt a profound and terrible helplessness. He was a duke. He commanded men in battle and swayed lords in parliament. He could ruin a man with a word or fund a war with a signature. But here, in this small room, faced with the failing breath of one small woman, he was utterly useless. All his power, all his wealth, meant nothing. He reached out and brushed a damp strand of hair from her forehead. Her skin was searingly hot. The only thing he had ever given her was a death sentence, and she had thrown it back in his face. Now, it seemed, the sentence was being carried out after all, and he discovered, to his own profound shock, that he could not bear it. The thought of her silence, of this house without her fierce, defiant spirit, was a void he could not contemplate. When Jane returned with a mountain of blankets, he piled them onto the bed. He took a cloth, dipped it in cool water, and bathed her forehead, her temples, her wrists. His movements were clumsy at first, the actions of a man unaccustomed to any form of gentle care. He was used to command, not comfort. But as he tended to her, a grim focus took over. This was a battle, just like any other. The enemy was the fever, the damp, the weakness in her lungs, and he would not lose. He sat with her through the long afternoon and into the evening, listening to the storm rage outside and the strained, shallow rhythm of her breathing within. He became a sentry, a guardian at the gates of her life. He forced sips of water between her cracked lips. He held her hand when the shivers became convulsions. He saw the vulnerability she kept so carefully hidden, the sheer physical frailty that her iron will usually mask. The doctor finally arrived late that night, a stout, weary man smelling of wet wool and whiskey. He examined Alara, his face growing graver by the moment. He listened to her chest with a stethoscope, his expression grim. He straightened up and turned to Alistair, who stood by the fire, a rigid statue of tension. "It's a severe inflammation of the lungs, Your Grace," the doctor said quietly. "Given her history, it's very serious. The fever is dangerously high. The next 24 hours will be critical." He spoke with the professional pessimism of a man who had seen this fight lost many times before. He left powders to be mixed with water and instructions for steam inhalations, but his eyes held little hope. After the doctor left, Alistair stood for a long time, staring into the fire. The man's words echoed in his head. Critical. He had wanted her to die quietly. He had wished for it, planned for it. Now, faced with the stark reality of that wish coming true, he felt a tearing agony in his chest, a desperate, savage need to deny it. He turned back to the bed. Alara was moaning softly, her head thrashing on the pillow. The blankets were a mountain, but she was still cold, her body unable to generate its own heat against the fever's assault. He knew, with a sudden, primal certainty, what he had to do. The doctor's potions and powders were not enough. She needed warmth. Real, living warmth. He stripped off his coat and waistcoat, kicked off his boots, and lay down on the bed beside her, outside the covers. He pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her trembling body. She was so small, so fragile in his embrace. He was a furnace, and she was a block of ice. He held her tightly, willing his own strength, his own heat, into her. He felt the violent shivers that racked her frame. He heard the faint, painful hitch in her breathing. He held her closer, his chin resting on the top of her head, her hair smelling faintly of rosemary and rain. He was the Duke of Blackwood, a man of ice and iron, and he was holding his discarded, dying wife in his arms, trying to warm her back to life. "You will not do this," he murmured into her hair, the words a low, fierce vow spoken to her, to the house, to God, to whatever force was trying to steal her from him. "I will not allow it. You are a fighter, so fight." He held her through the night, a human shield against the cold and the dark. He did not sleep. He simply held on, the master of the house reduced to the most basic and desperate of roles. A caregiver, a guardian, a source of warmth. He had abandoned her to the cold. Now, it would be her fire. And as the storm broke and the first, weak light of dawn crept into the room, he realized with a terrifying clarity that he was not just fighting for her life. He was fighting for his own. The fever broke just before dawn. One moment, she was a rigid, shivering form in his arms, burning with a dry, consuming heat. The next, she went limp, and a sheen of sweat broke out across her forehead. The violent shivers subsided into a faint trembling. Her breathing, while still shallow, lost its ragged, desperate edge and deepened into the rhythm of true sleep. Alistair did not move. He lay there, holding her, his own body aching with tension, listening to the miraculous sound of her steady breath. The rain had stopped, and a profound, exhausted silence settled over the house. In the gray morning light, he looked down at her face, peaceful in sleep. The fever had scoured her, leaving her pale and hollowed out, but she was alive. The crisis had passed. She had fought, and she had won. He felt a wave of relief so profound it left him weak. It was followed by a complex and unsettling flood of other emotions. Guilt, tenderness, a fierce, primal possessiveness that had nothing to do with titles or property. He had spent the night holding this woman, feeling the frail, tenacious flutter of her life against his own chest. And it had changed him. The icy detachment that had been his armor for years had been melted away by the heat of her fever, leaving him raw and exposed. Carefully, so as not to wake her, he disentangled himself. He stood and looked down at her, a small, fragile figure lost in the vastness of his bed. He felt a sudden, urgent need to do something practical. The grand, ducal gesture was useless. What was needed now were the small acts of care he had never learned. He went downstairs. The house was quiet, the servants not yet stirring. The fire in the study had died down to glowing embers. He went into the kitchen, a territory he had not set foot in for 20 years. It was clean and orderly, a testament to Alara's influence. A pot of water sat on the stove, still warm. He found a tea caddy, measured out leaves into a pot, and brewed a cup of tea. The simple, domestic act felt foreign and strangely significant. He, the Duke of Blackwood, was making tea. It was a measure of how far his world had been upended. He carried the cup back upstairs. She was still sleeping, her breathing even. He sat in the chair by the bed and waited, sipping the hot, strong tea, the warmth of the cup a small comfort in his hands. He watched the sun rise, painting the sky in bruised shades of pink and orange. He looked around the small, functional room, at the worn but clean furniture, the neatly stacked books, the lack of any ducal grandeur. This was the room she had deemed suitable for him. And it was in this room, her choice, that he had just fought the most important battle of his life. When Alara finally woke, it was late morning. Her first sensation was one of profound weakness, as if all her bones had been turned to water. Her second was warmth, a deep, penetrating warmth that reached all the way to her core. She was cocooned in a mountain of blankets, and a robust fire was blazing in the hearth. She was not in her own damp, cold room. She turned her head, the movement an enormous effort, and saw him. Alistair was asleep in the armchair, his head slumped against the high back, his long legs stretched out before him. In the harsh light of day, he looked exhausted. There were dark shadows under his eyes, and his usually immaculate clothes were rumpled. A dark stubble shadowed his jaw. He looked not like a duke, but like a man who had kept a long and difficult vigil. Memory returned in confusing, feverish fragments. The cold, the coughing, being lifted, carried. A voice, rough and close, murmuring in her ear. And a feeling of being held, of a strong, steady warmth pressed against her back. She looked at him, asleep in the chair, and then at the bed she was lying in. It was his bed. A slow, disbelieving flush crept up her neck. He had taken care of her. The man who had sent her here to die had stayed and fought for her life. The irony was so profound it was almost painful. She tried to sit up, but the movement sent a wave of dizziness through her and ended in a weak cough. The sound woke him instantly. His head snapped up, and his eyes, clear and alert, focused on her. Section, you're awake," he said. His voice was rough from lack of sleep. Evidently, she managed, her own voice a dry whisper. "What happened? You collapsed. You had a fever," he said, his tone clipped and factual, as if reporting on crop yields. He rose and came to the bedside. The doctor came. He said, "You have an inflammation of the lungs." He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. He said, "You were a fool for working yourself into the ground." It was not what the doctor had said, but it was what Alistair clearly thought. And yet, there was no heat in the words, only a strange, weary flatness. "I had things to do," she whispered, defensive even in her weakness. "The house would not have fallen down in a day," he retorted. He poured a glass of water from a jug on the nightstand and held it to her lips. "Drink." It was an order, but his hand was gentle as he supported her head. She drank, the cool water a balm on her raw throat. When she was done, she sank back against the pillows, exhausted by the small effort. "You should not have. I would have been fine," she murmured, though they both knew it was a lie. "No, you would not have been," he said bluntly. He looked at her, and for the first time, the mask of ducal indifference slipped, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. "I was wrong," he said, the words costing him, "to leave you here, in this place. It was a cruelty I did not fully comprehend." Alara stared at him. An apology. It was the last thing she ever expected to hear from him. It was a confession of weakness, a crack in his armor. And it changed the landscape between them more than any argument or battle of wills. She saw not the cold, pragmatic Duke, but a man confronting his own failure. She did not know what to say. "Thank you felt inadequate. I forgive you felt like a lie." So she said the most practical thing she could think of. "The accounts," she whispered, her mind falling back into its familiar groove. "The third quarter summary is not finished." A ghost of a smile, the first she had ever seen, touched his lips. It transformed his harsh features, making him look younger, less burdened. "The account can wait," he said. "Rest. That is an order from your physician. And from your husband." The word hung in the air between them, clumsy and unfamiliar. He had used it not as a claim of ownership, but as a statement of a new, unexamined fact. a responsibility he was for the first time acknowledging. He pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down, resuming his vigil. But it was different now. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful stillness. The silence in the room was no longer a weapon, but shared space. A truce. In the quiet aftermath of the crisis, a fragile new dynamic began to form. Alara's recovery was slow. For several days, she was too weak to leave the bed, a frustrating confinement for a woman accustomed to constant motion. Alistair, to her continued astonishment, became her reluctant but dedicated nurse. He did not fuss or coddle. His care was as pragmatic as she was. He made sure the fire never went out. He brought her meals himself, not gruel, but nourishing broths and toast prepared by the cook. He administered the doctor's medicines at the prescribed times with grim efficiency. They spoke little, but the silence between them evolved. It was no longer the icy void of their first days together, nor the tense standoff of their Cold War. It became a comfortable, shared quiet, punctuated by the rustle of a newspaper as he read, or the soft scratch of her pen as she, against his orders but unable to be completely idle, made weak, spidery notes in a small notebook he had brought her. One afternoon, he found her staring at the ceiling, a frown on her face. "The roof," she said without preamble. "The temporary patch won't hold the winter. We need new lead for the whole East Wing corridor. I sold the last of the salvageable metal for the stable shingles." He listened, not dismissing her. He had spent the last few days living in the reality she had created, a world governed not by titles, but by the brutal logistics of leaking roofs and finite funds. "I looked at the ledgers," he said, surprising her. "The ones you annotated." He paused, as if weighing his words. "Your management has been effective, but you're running on fumes. There is no capital for a project of that scale." "I know," she said, frustration clear in her voice. "I was hoping to lease the north pasture to Farmer Giles, but his own harvest was poor. He cannot afford it until spring." Alistair was quiet for a long moment. He looked from her pale, determined face to the roaring fire, then back again. "There are other assets," he said slowly. "The Blackwood portfolio is not limited to this estate. There are holdings in London, shipping interests." She stared at him. "You would use your personal funds? For this house?" "This house," he corrected her gently, "is bleeding you dry. And it is my house. The neglect is my failure. Therefore, the repairs are my responsibility." It was a simple, logical declaration, but it felt momentous. He was not just offering money. He was claiming ownership not of the title, but of the problem. He was taking on the burden he had for so long ignored. "I see," she said softly. And for the first time, they were not adversaries. They were partners, looking at the same problem. When she was finally strong enough to leave the room, leaning lightly on his arm, she found the house subtly changed. A sense of quiet order prevailed, but Alistair's presence was now woven into it. He had taken over the task of managing the crucial repairs. He had sent for his London solicitor, not to sell her off, but to liquidate a block of shares to fund the restoration of the roof. He conferred with Thomas not as a distant master, but as a man who now had a vested interest in the quality of the work. Their first true joint project was the study. One morning, she came down to find him with the estate ledgers spread across the large desk, a look of intense frustration on his face. "This filing system is chaos," he grumbled, gesturing to a teetering pile of receipts. "How do you find anything?" "I have a system," she said, a defensive edge to her voice. "It's chronological by acquisition." "It's madness," he countered. "It needs to be cross-referenced by vendor and category of expense." Instead of arguing, she pulled up a chair. "Show me." And so they began. They spent the entire day in the study, a fire crackling in the hearth, working side by side. He, with his mind trained for complex financial structures, created a new system of organization. She, with her intimate, ground-level knowledge of every transaction, provided the context and detail. They argued over the price of nails, debated the efficiency of the new stove, and planned the budget for the coming year. At one point, reaching for the same ledger, their hands brushed. It was a brief, accidental contact, but a jolt of warmth shot up Alara's arm. It was not romantic. It was grounding. It was the touch of a fellow soldier in the trenches. She pulled her hand back, a faint flush on her cheeks, and saw a flicker of the same surprise in his eyes. They were two separate, fiercely independent people, but for a few hours they had become a single, functioning unit. That evening, they ate dinner together in the small dining room, a room she had opened only a month before. The silence was comfortable, the easy quiet of two people who had spent the day in productive labor. "You were right," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "About the vendor cross-referencing. It's more efficient." It was a small concession, but it was an admission of her value, of her expertise in this world she had built. "And you were right," she conceded in return, a small smile playing on her lips. "My filing system was chaos." He looked at her across the table, his gaze direct and stripped of its former coldness. He saw the woman who had survived his neglect, who had tamed his ruin, who had nearly died because of his failure. And he felt not pity, but a profound and humbling respect. She was the strongest person he had ever known. "We make a good team, you and I," he said, the words an unplanned revelation. "It would appear so, Your Grace," she replied, her voice soft. "Alistair," he corrected her. "My name is Alistair." She held his gaze. "Alara." The truce had become something more. It had become a partnership. The foundations of a new life, built not on a solicitor's contract, but on shared work and grudging respect, were being laid, stone by practical stone, in the heart of Blackwood Manor. The first snows of winter arrived, blanketing the moors in a pristine, silent white. The new roof held. The house was a fortress of warmth and light against the cold, its chimneys pluming smoke into the crisp air. The rhythm of life at Blackwood settled into a quiet domesticity that was utterly foreign to Alistair. He had spent his life in motion, at war, in Parliament, in the endless, restless pursuit of duty. This stillness, this focus on the small, essential tasks of survival and comfort, was a revelation. He found a strange peace in mucking out a stall with Thomas, a quiet satisfaction in splitting wood for the fireplaces. He was rediscovering a connection to the physical world, a grounding he had lost years ago in the corridors of power. His partnership with Alara deepened, evolving in the shared quiet of the winter evenings. They would sit in the study, the great desk, now a shared workspace, and plan for the spring. They designed crop rotations for the expanded kitchen gardens and debated the merits of acquiring a dairy cow. Their conversations were always practical, rooted in the tangible reality of their small, self-contained world. But beneath the talk of budgets and planting schedules, something else was growing, a deep, unspoken intimacy. He learned the nuances of her expressions, the small furrow between her brows when a column of figures refused to add up, the faint, ironic smile that meant she had won an argument, the way her gray eyes would soften when she looked out at the snow-covered garden she had brought back from the dead. He found himself watching for these small signs, learning the language of her silences. She, in turn, began to see past the Duke's formidable facade. She saw the weariness that still clung to him, the way he would sometimes stare into the fire, his eyes distant and haunted, his mind clearly replaying battles she could not imagine. She saw the loneliness in him, a profound isolation that mirrored her own. One evening, she found him in the library, running a hand over the spine of a worn book of poetry. "My father's," she said softly from the doorway. They were the books she had asked about, her only dowry. He turned, startled. "I did not mean to pry." "It's all right," she said, entering the room. He loved these. He would have been glad to know someone was appreciating them. He had good taste, Alistair said, his voice quiet. He opened the book and read a few lines aloud, his low, resonant voice giving the words a weight and beauty she had never noticed before. It was a moment of unexpected connection, a shared appreciation for something beyond the practicalities of their existence. It was a glimpse into the man he might have been before war and duty had hollowed him out. The comfortable quiet of their new life was shattered on a bitterly cold afternoon in January. The sound was the same one that had heralded Alistair's return, a horse ridden hard, its hooves crunching on the frozen drive. But this time it was not just a horse. It was a royal courier, his uniform a slash of scarlet against the white landscape, the horse's flanks lathered in sweat. Alara was in the hall, hanging bundles of dried herbs from the rafters, when a man burst through the door, bringing a blast of frigid air with him. "A dispatch for the Duke of Blackwood," he announced, his breath pluming in the cold. "From His Majesty's office. Urgent." Alistair appeared from the study, his face instantly hardening, the old mask of the cold, powerful Duke snapping back into place. He took the oilskin pouch from the courier, his movements sharp and efficient. Alara watched, her heart sinking. The scarlet of the uniform, the imperial seal on the dispatch. It was the outside world, the world of power and politics he had fled, breaking into their sanctuary. She felt a cold dread creep over her. He was a duke. He had duties, responsibilities that went far beyond this small, reclaimed patch of earth. She had been a fool to think he could ever truly belong here. Her defenses, so recently and cautiously lowered, snapped back into place. The partnership, the shared quiet, the nascent tenderness, it all felt like a foolish dream. She was the temporary caretaker. He was the absent lord, briefly returned. Now, the real world was calling him back. He broke the seal and read the letter, his expression growing grimmer with each line. The political coalition he had helped build in London was fracturing. A crisis was brewing, and the king was summoning him back to the capital to contain the damage. It was the call of duty, the summons he had spent his entire life trained to obey. When he looked up, his eyes met hers across the hall. He saw the change in her instantly. The warmth and openness of the past weeks were gone, replaced by a cool, formal distance. Her face was a polite, unreadable mask. She had already retreated from him, bracing herself for his departure. "I will have a room prepared for the courier," she said, her voice the epitome of the efficient chatelaine, "and see that his horse is tended to. You will need to leave at first light, I imagine." She did not ask what the letter said. She did not ask if he was leaving. She assumed it. She assumed he would revert to the man he had been, the man who had abandoned her without a second thought. The assumption was a knife in his gut, because it was what he deserved. It was what he would have done 3 months ago. "Alara," he began, taking a step toward her. "If you will excuse me, Your Grace," she said, cutting him off with cold precision, using the formal title like a shield. "I have tasks to attend to if the household is to be prepared for your absence." She turned her back on him and walked toward the kitchens, her posture rigid, her head held high. Each step was a deliberate act of distancing, a reconstruction of the fortress he had only just begun to breach. Alistair stood alone in the great hall, the king's summons in one hand, the scent of her drying herbs in the air. He was caught between two worlds. One was the world of power, duty, and expectation, the world that had made him and nearly broken him. The other was this small, quiet world of warmth, purpose, and a woman with storm-gray eyes who had shown him what it meant to build something instead of just holding it together. He looked at the royal dispatch, at the elegant script demanding his return. It was his duty. It was his life's work. And he realized with a sudden, shocking clarity that he no longer wanted it. He followed her. He found her in the kitchen, issuing brisk, cool orders to the cook about packing provisions for a long journey. She was all business, all efficiency. She was the Duchess of Blackwood managing her estate, and he was once again the master who was passing through. "Stop," he said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the kitchen's bustling sounds, bringing everything to a halt. The cook and the maid scurried away, sensing a storm. Alara turned to face him, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. "Is there something you require, Your Grace?" "Do not call me that," he said, his voice low and intense. He took a step closer. "And stop this. Stop acting as if I am a guest who has overstayed his welcome." "Are you not?" she countered, her voice sharp. "The king calls. Your real life awaits. I am merely facilitating your return to it." My real life? He asked, a bitter, humorless laugh escaping him. You think that cesspit of ambition and betrayal is my real life? Endless meetings, hollow victories, propping up a system that is as rotten as this house was when I first brought you here? That is not a life, Alara. It is a sentence. He took another step, closing the distance between them. He could see the struggle in her eyes, the conflict between her pride and the flicker of hope she was trying so desperately to extinguish. I came back to Blackwood to die, he confessed, the words raw and honest. I was empty. There was nothing left inside me but dust and duty. And then I found you, alive. You had taken this ruin, this symbol of all my family's failures, and you had breathed life into it. You built a home here. He reached out, not to touch her, but holding up the king's dispatch. This, he said, his voice filled with contempt, is a summons back to the tomb, to a world of ghosts and shadows. He looked directly into her eyes and let her see everything he felt, the weariness, the desperation, the startling, terrifying hope she had ignited in him. My duty is no longer to a crown or a parliament. My duty is to the life we have started to build within these walls. My duty is to this home. And then, in a gesture of shocking, irrevocable finality, he strode to the huge kitchen hearth. The fire was roaring, heating a great cauldron of water. He did not hesitate. He thrust the royal dispatch into the heart of the flames. Alara gasped as the parchment blackened, curled, and was consumed by the fire. The king's seal melted into a formless blob before vanishing into ash. It was an act of treason, an act of rebellion. It was a burning of the final bridge to his old life. He turned back to her, his face illuminated by the firelight, his eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering intensity. There is nothing for me in London, he said, his voice dropping to a raw, vulnerable whisper. He took the final step that separated them, and this time he did reach for her. He took her hands, his grip firm and warm. Her hands were cold as ice. You are my home, Alara. The words, so simple, so direct, shattered the last of her defenses. All the fight, all the pride, all the carefully constructed walls she had hidden behind for years, crumbled into dust. He was not leaving. He was staying. He had chosen this, chosen her, over everything. A single tear, hot and unexpected, escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. Then another. The strength that had sustained her for so long finally broke, not in weakness, but in overwhelming relief. She had not been a fool to hope. She did not pull her hand away. Instead, her fingers curled around his, clinging to him. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his chest, a gesture of complete and unconditional surrender. She could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her ear. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into an embrace that was not about passion, but about sanctuary. It was an anchor in the storm. He held her as she wept, silent tears of exhaustion and joy and disbelief, his hand stroking her hair. He was home. They both were. Outside, the winter wind howled around the corners of the old house. But inside, in the warm, fire-lit kitchen, there was only a profound and perfect stillness. They stood holding each other, two survivors who had found an unexpected harbor. They were a permanent fixture against the coming darkness, in the heart of a house that was, like them, no longer a tomb, but fiercely alive and completely whole. The winter would be long, but for the first time, neither of them would face it alone.